Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Kinawi, Marketing Manager at the American University in Cairo Press. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual book discussion of Making Roots, Mobility, and the Politics of Migration in the Global South, published by AUC Press in April 2024. Today's event is going to be around 1 hour, and we will have room for some Q&A at the end. So please, if you have any questions, type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you're joining on Facebook, you can always type your questions in the comment section. I will ask them on your behalf. Our book today, Making Roots, Mobility, and the Politics of Migration in the Global South, is a rich interdisciplinary study of the diversity and dynamics of the migrations of displaced people across the Global South. 17 academics, activists, and artists from a range of backgrounds and disciplines reveal the diverse narratives, migration patterns, forms of agency, and laws that make up the complex reality of South-South migration, offering a vital new pathways for research and migration studies today. The book is available worldwide through major bookstores and online book retailers, and I'll be sharing links so you can order your copy in the chat box. We're delighted today to have with us the book editors. We're joined by Gerda Heck, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of Sociology, Egyptology, and Anthropology, and at the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo. Eda Sevinin, an independent researcher. She received her PhD in 2022 from Central European University, Department of International Relations. Elena Habersky, PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow. Carlos Sandoval-García, Professor of Cultural Studies, University of Costa Rica. And they will be joined by one of the book contributors, Kudakwashe Vanyoro, lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, interested in migration, temporality, borders, humanitarianism, and governance in Africa. And we're also very delighted to have with us as a discussant and moderator today, Sujata Ramachandran. She's project manager for the New Frontiers and Research Fund at Balsili School of International Affairs and Wilfrid Laurier University. Sujata has extensive experience researching various aspects of migration in Canada, South Africa, and South Asia. We look forward to an engaging conversation, and I encourage you to participate by asking questions in the Q&A box throughout the event. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists. And now over to Gerda.
Okay. Thank you very much, Susan, for organizing this event and this book launch. We've been looking for a long time forward to it, and for the introduction. Before I start, I would also like to thank you on behalf of our editing team, all the contributors and the authors of the book for their patience, first of all, but also for their contributions, for their richer contributions, and everyone else who supported us during the workshop, which was at the start of this book. All the people who did logistic things, who did copy editing or reading copies and whatever. Thank you, all of them. Due to the time, I cannot mention all of them because it was really a long list. It's all in the book. I was asked to talk a bit about the book, how it came into life. Let's put it like that. It was actually an outcome of a workshop we had in the fall of 2019 in Cairo at the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University. And when we came up with the idea in 2019, we were thinking like there's a lot of things going on. A lot of people were coming and wanting to have approach, but actually focus at that time on the Global South was really still scarce. Barely at that time. There were, of course, editions. And since then, we know there have been coming out several editions and several kind of books and research on Global South. But when we're looking from our perspective here in Cairo, we would say that still, especially after the 2015 so-called migration crisis in Europe, outlook and research is still kind of focused on the plight from the south to the north. Which is also reflected very often when we are looking on how funding is kind of distributed. And again, we know there is a lot of research done, which is focusing now on Global South and on the diversity on the Global South, on the African continent, on the Asian continent. But I think there needs to be still more done. The politicization, which is in the Global North, and I think which has repercussion also on research, is undoubtedly is focusing very often on the global north and centralizing it, especially if we say like on Europe, for instance, and has this idea that migrants are coming always from the global south to the global north, and it's still persistent somehow. But when we look then on the data, we know that the majority of migrants in the global south are migrating within the global south in other regions, regional to other continents, or on the continent to other countries. And especially when we are looking then on the vast majority of refugees worldwide, they are still also today located in Africa and in Asia, and also in Latin America, but predominantly in Africa and Asia. When we were thinking of our book, we had wanted to look more on a deeper look on this migration patterns, on forms of displacement, but also on migratory trajectories, legislation, and agencies of migrants, and kind of including their perspectives from different perspectives. We have not only academic contributions in this book from anthropology, from music, from ethnology, from sociology or media studies. We also have artistic approaches in the book. And some of these approaches or contributions have a specialized activist approach to the topic. And I think this is also important. When you're thinking about kind of dividing the book, you're thinking whether dividing it according to the geographical lines, like this is like Latin America or this is Africa. We wanted to divide it to, according to aspects, to topics, like how are states acting in a certain way, and trying to see where are kind of like the parallel, the similarities and the disadvantages around the range. Well, our primary focus, and this is probably what I'm concluding, was to look on the global south. We still recognize the importance of the interconnected connection between migratory patterns in the global north and the global south. And I think this is important. The borders between south and north are geographically vague. They are culturally, politically, and economically totally permanently. So to say, I mean, there is always the global south in the global north and the global north and the global south, and we cannot kind of like put it away. And with this, I will stop here. Once again, thank you very much to Sujata and to Kuda who are discussing our book today. And I want to hand over to Sujata, who has a small presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerda. Let me begin my slideshow. Sorry, can you see the slideshow?
Yes, looks good.
Great. Okay. So good afternoon to everyone from Toronto, Canada. Just to add to the very kind introduction for me, I'm just going to say that I'm part of the My Food Network and Hungry Cities Partnership, which is housed at the Balsillie School. We are an international research network that is looking at the linkages between migration and food security, looking at in relation to critical themes such as livelihoods and remittances. And I have taken over a new project called the Remitting for Resilience Project, which has been funded by the New Frontiers and Research Fund initiative of the Government of Canada. But I've been involved with the My Food Network since it began about 3 years ago. I was a postdoctoral fellow there. So I'm going to begin, first of all, by thanking the editors of Making Roots, Mobility and the Politics of Migration in the Global South for their very kind invitation to participate in this book launch event. So thank you very much, Eda, Elena, Gerda, and Carlos. I'm going to provide a short set of comments for about 15 minutes or so, based on the context of the contents of the book, and by connecting it to the broader discussion on the location and treatment of South-South migration in migration studies. Some of the points have been made by Gerda just now, but I'm going to reinforce those points again. I'm going to revisit those points. Sorry, I'm trying to see how to. Okay, so let me begin by placing South-South migration in the broader field of migration studies. For a long period, South-South migration was a neglected aspect of migration studies. Until fairly recently, it was not uncommon to see edited volumes on global migration in which most chapters were focusing on North-South migration. Now, this has been a significant omission because several studies have confirmed that the magnitude of South-South migration is equal to and even higher than the North-South flows. And this is especially the case when less documented and less formal migration flows and mobilities are considered. However, things have been changing for the better in the last few years. As Gerda and Eda note in the concluding chapter, there has been increased interest in South-South migration, and the number of studies on South-South migration has been growing. Making Roots is a very welcome addition to this smaller yet growing body of studies on South-South migration. As Suzanne just mentioned, this edited volume includes contributions by 17 migration researchers and others based in or with strong linkages to a wide range of countries and regions of the global South. And some of these countries are Bangladesh, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Egypt, Ghana, Turkey, and South Africa. The background of contributors represents the widest variety of disciplines such as anthropology, communication, cultural studies, international law, philosophy, political science, and sociology. While not all contributors are researchers and active in academia, it is evident that they maintain a keen interest in migration studies and mobility in their work as journalists, individuals working with NGOs and CSOs, and as creative artists, performers, and storytellers. In terms of geographical coverage, Making Roots has attempted to engage with the regions of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Middle East in the various chapters. Making Roots also responds to recent calls by scholars like Elena Habersky to recenter the global South in migration studies. This important exercise of recentering will rectify the prevailing Eurocentrism in migration studies in several ways. Two of these ways are to focus on migration in the South and South-South migration, and the other is by critically examining the geopolitics of knowledge production. And Dr. Vanyoro is going to speak about the latter aspect shortly. As far as methodology is concerned, several chapters have adopted a variety of research practices, and some have used discursive texts in their analysis. So, for example, Gerda has used multi-sited ethnography in urban areas to examine the relationship between religion and migration in the global South. In chapter 12, David Bolanos Acuna has used photographs to highlight the precarity of Nicaraguan irregular migrants and the arduous conditions under which they labor in the sugarcane fields of Costa Rica. Likewise, Sally Soraya's photo essay of refugee camps for Syria and Lebanon, showing donor logos and underscores the lasting power and influence of the global North in the global South. Her contribution highlights the emphasis on refugee containment in neighboring countries in the global North, in the global South, away from the global North. Other contributors have critically scrutinized the research process and knowledge production in terms of positionality and reflexivity, such as chapter 1 by Sarah Sadek. Drawing on ethnographic research in Egypt and by looking at the management of refugees in this country, she examines how migration researchers in the global South navigate their position and work within local and global power dynamics. She discusses her role as a local researcher on the threshold of being an insider and outsider in the field of forced migration in Egypt. She shows how the research process by both scholars and practitioners has very little engagement with refugees, produces few benefits for these communities, and tends to follow easy strategies such as conducting research through NGOs and CSOs. She also shows how the relationship between NGOs and CSOs and refugee communities is not always straightforward or easy. In their contribution, Dudu Zile, Dr. Ndlovu, and Kuda have made a strong case for using participatory practices and alternative sources, such as poems and photographs, for activist-oriented research on South-South migration. The objective of these alternative research practices is also to unsettle the often hierarchical and unequal relationships between the researcher and the research, especially when working with marginal migrant groups and communities. Another important feature of Making Roots is that it does not treat South-South migration as an exceptional category of flows that is somehow separate and entirely removed from North-South migration. Instead, it attempts to trace the linkages and connections between the two sets of mobilities and movements defined by the distinctive geographies of origin and destination and the asymmetrical relationships embedded in them. The book also underscores the mutual interdependencies of the border regimes in the global South and global North. So the example here is chapter 7, in that the contributors Leander Candelige and Thomas Yeboah address how the European Union's border externalization strategies are transforming migration governance in West Africa by weakening the free movement protocols of ECOWAS. The relationship between the West and the rest is also critically articulated by Daniel Ferrari in chapter 3 by engaging with displacement, tragedy, art, and humanitarianism. Using the example of memorial artworks by the Chinese dissident artist Ai Weiwei on the tragic death of Alan Kurdi and what has been constantly publicized as the European refugee crisis, Daniel's contribution shows how the West is constantly represented and reproduced as the ideal destination for global South refugees. The broader context of several contributions is crisis and the exodus of migrants and refugees from affected, in some cases, fragile settings. Here, special reference has been made to the long summer of migration in 2015, when large-scale flows tied to prolonged and various forms of crisis were witnessed in multiple contexts around the global South, Syria, South Sudan, and Venezuela, to name a few prominent cases. The linkages between crisis, forced migration, and humanitarian responses is another important theme running through several of the chapters. For example, Eda Sevinin discusses how Turkey has used the crisis discourse to justify their migration and refugee management, and the country's humanitarian response favors temporary protection for refugees in place of fully recognized rights and status. The politicization of migration is another common theme running through a number of contributions. The politics of identity and belonging and how it shapes migration flows and patterns and migrant reception is a crucial consideration. Certain communities or groups are framed and vilified as illegitimate outsiders in exclusionary forms of nationalism, and their acute expressions can legitimize violent forms of othering. In their important contribution on the Rohingya refugees, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui and Dr. Chaudhry Rafiul Abrar analyzed the state policies of Burma or Myanmar that have reduced these citizens to refugees and triggered the exodus of this historically marginalized community from this country, described by the UN as the most persecuted minority in the world. The intensified governance of migration in the global South is an important dimension discussed in the book, in the introduction, and also in the various chapters. These contributions address how contemporary migration regimes circumscribe both immobility and mobility, and the informal, less secure pathways used by migrants across multiple countries. In chapter 8, Melanie Montinard explores the often circuitous routes adopted by Haitian migrants from Brazil to make a better life and their risky attempts to reach the US, Miami. She also engages with migrant aspirations and agency in her contribution. The theme of migrant agency and fragmented journeys is also the focus of Elena Habersky's chapter. She highlights the long and difficult routes of Darfuris to escape armed conflicts from Darfur to Amman, back to Khartoum and onwards to Cairo in their attempts to seek security. Deportation and prolonged waiting periods in transit mark these refugee journeys. Some chapters examine the social and economic processes tied to migration and mobilities. A very interesting example is Gerda's contribution, chapter 10, which analyzes how Pentecostal religious practices make new spaces for Congolese migrants in the prominent cities of the global south, Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, and Guangzhou. In a different chapter, Evrim Ogut uses music to document the migratory experiences of Chaldean Christian migrants from Iraq and their transit experience in Istanbul. Many chapters directly and indirectly engage with the fluidity and dynamism of migration flows across the global south and their consequences for receiving countries, settings, and migrant integration. Settings that were once prominent receivers of migrants can rapidly convert into major sending countries, witnessing large-scale outmigration. Zimbabwe and Venezuela are two prominent examples mentioned in the book. In chapter 14, Alison Wolfe notes how before 2016, Venezuela was a prominent destination country for Colombians and how this situation has reversed in recent years. Colombia now hosts the largest number of Venezuelan migrants, and according to latest estimates, there are nearly 3 million Venezuelan migrants in Colombia who have fled the country's devastating economic crisis. Despite efforts to welcome Venezuelans in Colombia, these arrivals constantly grapple with what she terms global oppression. And by global oppression, she's referring to the structural or systematic forms of exploitation, violence, and vulnerability migrants often endure in the host or receiving country settings, including xenophobia, lack of documentation, and lack of rights or very limited rights. Xenophobia is also an important theme in chapter 13 on Nicaraguan migration to Costa Rica. In this chapter, Carlos discusses the long history of flows between the two countries. He also analyzes the new forced migration movements from Nicaragua resulting from protests in 2018 against the Carlos Ortega government and connects this to decisive political shifts in Costa Rica and how these momentous events have intensified anti-migrant tendencies in Costa Rica. The contribution also draws attention to how migration and migrants are perceived as sources of contagion and affected by intensifying xenophobia during the global crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. The final positive quality of this book, which I want to highlight here, is that it will appeal to several cohorts of migration scholars, practitioners, and others. It will certainly appeal to those who are already familiar with the key themes and debates in migration studies and are interested in South-South migration. It will also interest scholars and students who are just beginning to develop their familiarity with migration studies and with South-South migration. I want to end this presentation by congratulating the editors and contributors on the successful publication of this book. It is a testament to their dedication, hard work, and intellectual rigor. I hope that the book will spark important conversations about South-South migration and the human rights of migrants and refugees. I also hope that it will serve as an important resource for scholars, students, and migration practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sujata. I think we hand over to Kuda.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sujata, for that. I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah. Okay, great. And also, I'm just going to start off by congratulating Gerda, Elena, Eda, and Carlos for sort of curating this, and of course, special thanks to the publishers as well who who managed to put this collection together. I've been asked today to sort of respond to some of the connections, I suppose, between the content of the book and questions that have to do with sort of practice, which are also contained in the book. So some of the questions are, for example, how, looking from the perspective of South to South migration, how can we do research from a decolonial perspective that considers its own positioning from the South? What does it mean to produce knowledge on South migration? If we can even agree on that terminology to begin with, and what it signifies. And also, could we perhaps somewhat free ourselves from a kind of Western epistemology or perspective, and so what are the kinds of ideas we can think of to produce knowledge in the post-colonial context? And I think more importantly, how does the book perhaps sort of help us to think of those questions, or to begin to imagine what the answers could be. And so these are some of the questions that the editors of the collection have requested me to address in this very short intervention, which of course is by no means an easy task, because there's a lot to say on the topic, but I'll restrict myself to sort of three main talking points. Firstly, I'll sort of deal with this idea of positionality, because I suppose in thinking about the collection itself, one had to consider who's going to write this particular narrative. Humanitarianism and invisibility as an issue within South to South migration, and also just touch briefly on sort of some implications for methods. So I suppose the two issues raise some considerations for conversations about methods. So in terms of positionality, obviously the first thing I suppose the book responds to is the precarity in African scholarship, accessing funding, resources, accessing spaces to publish, and being able to be a part of networks and research partnerships. So one of the book, I think structurally, that the book is able to respond to is particularly that context, and especially in a context where the partnerships between North and South institutions have increased because of sort of some increase in Western and donor interest in Africa and the Middle East, which has made African-based migration focus more on issues of policy and activism, which often comes with some kind of division of labor, where African scholars somewhat in the field managing data collection, Western partners perhaps focusing more on framing questions, thinking of methods of inquiry, and also sometimes building capacity. And of course, we know that some of these relationships have evolved more towards including African migration scholars in framing questions, have been, called engaged and participatory knowledge generation approaches, but there's still a lot of collaborations that are also guided by hidden overarching agendas that are meant to inform some institutional responses, perhaps some EU policies on migration, which started in the context of the EU migration crisis. So that this is a space that makes it hard for African-based and African scholars like myself and others who are also in the collection, and also broadly speaking, people in the South, in the global South, who are also part of this writing collection, to define the social problems in the contemporary, right? Whether these are practical issues or theoretical issues, and usually people are, end up being brought in as juniors, and they have to show that they're actively engaged. So usually, the writing is about subjects that interest first and foremost the Western audience. The articles themselves are published in journals outside of Africa, right? So which is also great that this collection is part of, a press that is actually on the continent, and the readership as well. That can also somewhat shape what happens after the publication, who's able to read it, etc. So in a context where this is quite important as well, in the context where researchers in the North still often influence debates, choose the concepts, apply them into different places in the South, which is what Raghuram and Sondi have argued, which and then they say that Southern partners are folded into grants to try and test some of these things. So there's power obviously at play when people are simply brought in perhaps as co-authors. So in this particular environment as well, we see that there's a lot of competition that arises when also this kind of funding is limited, which sometimes explains fragmentation and why it's hard for scholars to come together and do one thing who are working on different issues across the South, across the continent, the African continent, or even if it's in the South American continent or subcontinent. So there's a lot of issues that are at stake when it comes to what this competition entails. Particularly, it means that people are often chasing rewards, awards, or status, and there isn't really much focus on how to sort of work together. People are really trying to define how to eloquently define and make a problem more interesting through what Fanon calls the white man's language, which he argues gives some kind of honorary citizenship. So what is so I suppose what it entails is that in response, one is to think of ways to ensure that people can write in ways that are comfortable with them, and not necessarily trying to sort of appease or tap into a particular kind of audience, which is, I think, was also one characteristics of the book in terms of the accessibility. And I think the edit as one of the contributors, I also noticed how the editing kind of process wasn't necessarily sort of a top-down process. It was quite sort of respectful in terms of the kind of language and approach. So it's not really trying to come to a particular kind of acceptable standard about this is how you write or this is how you structure. So the editors really did a good job in that regard. But going back to this idea of the coloniality of things like writing, is that usually to be a part of some a network of these institutions that are keynotes for organizing migration studies, you really need to be part of the semantic, what Pico et al. Call the semantic composition of the field, in terms of thinking of the defining of challenges, defining interesting subjects, issues, and themes, right? So this is also this is somewhat a radical act in trying to do things differently by defining what the issue is, right? And particularly this idea of looking at this south to south, right? Mobilities and migrations and movements. So this is all part of thinking about what I think what the book really signifies and symbolizes from these ideas of trying to talk about decolonization and these kinds of issues that are really important to us. But at the same time, relationally speaking, while it's important to be given space as a researcher from a marginalized or oppressed community, it is also important to bear in mind how there's the risk of sort of centering or reproducing these similar relationships in our particular localities. So the center periphery connections, in which marginalization becomes also another outcome of power relations. And and I think this also comes up in the book when I think Sujata has done a great job to present some of the chapters that deal with the insider-outsider position, which is an extra layer of power negotiation between participants and researchers that's invisible usually to Western partners, particularly how these are negotiated by different kinds of identities beyond simply whether you're European or African or Latin. These could be ethnic and gendered and so forth. And these are fluid and situated ideas. And I think these are also shaped by political economies, power structures, the ways that South-South relationships regulate and control the kind of research that we do with migrants and refugees, and who gets to do that research as well, right? Which raises questions when it comes to assuming that decolonizing migration research or the narrative or the story simply means that we are doing the writing and the storytelling, right? So we need to really think about this. So this is my sort of take on positionality matters. The next take is, suppose, is the humanitarian and the invisibility concept within the South to South migration. And already in the field, there's debates about the tendency to highlight the distinction between migrants and refugees. And I think this has been, and also assigning differential protections to the two categories. So this is obviously a debate that I wouldn't want to sort of get into or try to settle, but I think that understanding is important in thinking about, how, in whatever historical and geographical context, this presumption that there are clear lines between force and volition are sort of challenged when migrants face different kinds of risks, particularly physical security associated, for example, with violations of rights or discrimination or persecution. So I think writing from this perspective also allows us to sort of speak back to these ideas and these neat categories, right? So, and I think here we can also start to think about how these categories come to be and why they are there, and actually challenge some of these, productive relationships between humanitarian interventions, sometimes moral religious politics and migration governance that emerge from some sort of discursive acts of using these categories to delegitimize humanitarian crisis. And I think the book also touches on this, particularly how this works through public discourse. And this is a politics that in turn also shapes humanitarian and protection procedures, as well as the kind of conduct and practices that are on the ground that tend to be productive yet very dangerous because of their fluidity and dichotomizing and even exclusionary effects. So thinking about the humanitarian space and how it takes governmental authority and how it becomes a site of power, how it constructs legible figures of suffering, through moral sentiments, and how that's tied to contestations and definitions around crisis that facilitates instrumentalization of these categories in a sphere of contentious politics, which then becomes a novel site of governance, and particularly in borders, because of how it gives rise to practices that are again classificatory, and also the book touches on the complications that are presented by the outsourcing of the management of immigration enforcement to third parties, who then try to offer remedies, but also they bring complications, which allows humanitarian organizations to sort of try to turn misery into profit as well, and realize some gains from the reality of mobility. And I think importantly, particularly when there's protected failure to find solutions to underlying crisis, which is currently the case in Gaza. And here we find some competing discourses about crisis, identification of different responsible actors and their roles. And we see how definitions of a crisis revolve around doubling down on the argument that certain people are not refugees. So, for example, when Israeli ministers reiterated the ideas of Palestinians voluntarily migrating out of Gaza, and I would just call this an euphemism for forced displacement. So, in a nutshell, indeed, there are clear distinctions between connections between crisis and protection that serve to mark certain bodies as unworthy and even expendable. And I think the book allows us to think about, the incompatibility of hegemonic crisis conceptions with protection of people, and also to think critically in our own context about the motivations of people that are involved, particularly given that that power is involved. And, in going back to this idea of waiting that Elena's chapter touches on, tied to this, at least in the Palestinian case, is the overall goal of displacing more Palestinians, building more illegal settlements, as Craig Murray suggested. And, these spaces are kind of always aligned with current, or mostly aligned with dominant governance practices, official discourses, containment. And, while these are not all of them are necessarily deliberate, it's important to think about how this enhances humanitarian autonomy of our lives in ways that allows the state to remain visible and felt in these isolated spaces, and continually classify people as victims, agents, insiders, outsiders. And waiting is one concept that is used in this chapter, and people also deploy the immobilities concept as to think about it as a broader typology of power that allows us to think about how humanitarian institutions are also now caught up in some of this in this politics. So in my final point is about methods, and I think seeing that the way issues, the way the nature of things usually informs how we look at them and how we read them. These dynamics all shape how we see the world and also how we best go about interpreting it. So if we are to agree that these categories of migration are messy, fuzzy, contradictory, non-binary, intermeshed, and they also have some colonial attributes, we now have to ask what are the best way to look at these groups, and so we should be questioning some of the epistemic value in carrying out certain kinds of studies on certain kinds of topics, issues such as integration, etc. Thinking of borders, even the category of migration itself, questioning, inclusivity, even the idea of participatory approaches, and these different modes of inclusion. So we should be looking at, thinking along the lines of how to question some of these liberal conceptions of men that are specifically order reproducing concept of politics, as Schinkel would call it, which takes us to a place of also realizing, to use Schinkel's idea, that we cannot really realize serious decolonization while we continue to do what we do using different categories, but simply change the face of it. But I think the book, in wrapping up, offers several suggestions that can take us from this important politics without necessarily presenting them as neat or uneasy fixable issues that are not without their own limitations. And I think this reveals an understanding that perhaps, or bluntly put, definitely there will always be challenges bringing our epistemology to the discussion, regardless of how much we may shift knowledge production towards global south. But this is all, I think, a laudable start towards achieving that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kuda. Thank you very much for this very thoughtful, very insightful contribution. So how should we proceed? Should we proceed with Sujata's questions that she said she has, or should we proceed to opening the floor to the audience for Q&A? What would you like to do, Sujata?
While we're waiting for questions from the audience, I think we're running out of time. We have only 15 minutes left. Maybe I could ask the question. And yes, that was an excellent set of comments by Kuda, raising lots of points for us to critically consider as we do research. I think let me sort of go back to the process itself. And as someone who's just worked on an edited volume on South-South migration, I was really interested in knowing what the process was, because South-South migration includes many contexts, many themes. How did you decide what to focus on, which context, which crisis, whether it was a spectacular one that received more attention, others that received less attention, and also raising some of the key issues that Kuda has talked about, like how did you then settle on who to invite and how to put together, the book in simply 14 chapters. It could have been 50 or 100 as well to address all these, the key different important themes that emerge. So maybe you could individually talk a little bit about the process.
I'll give the floor to my colleagues. I just realized that I forgot to thank you, Sujata, for your amazing contribution and presentation. So I just wanted to say this, your comments are much welcome and most valuable.
Thank you.
So I became involved in the book editing project quite a bit later, and I myself was blocked by the visa policies of certain countries, so I was away from the workshop, unfortunately. So maybe my colleagues can start how they organize the certain everything at the beginning.
Gerda, do you maybe want to start about the workshop and then I'll talk about what we wanted to include in the book project?
You want, I mean, I can start. I mean, actually, these are crucial questions, and I don't remember anymore how we selected who we can invite and who we wanted to invite. Let's start it like that. We had little money to do this workshop, and we were like thinking that we would like to have from different regions people, of course, like from different, like whatever. But of course, at the end, we were not able to invite everyone we wanted. People had to decline. We had several people who could not attend because of visa issues, which is very interesting because we had a workshop in the Global South. So, and I think following that, we just sat together and came together and were thinking about our contributions, what we wanted to have. If you want to have we actually made afterwards a call for artists who want to participate, because we felt like it should not only be only academic approach. We should really like think about other approaches. Yes. We, of course, were limited by the book. We were also limited when you're asking why not 50 contributions, because we, of course, had some limitations page-wise. Elena, maybe you can go hang on.
Yeah, so thank you, Gerda. Just one thing I want to reiterate, and I think it kind of goes off of what Kuda was talking about knowledge production, but also methodology, migration studies, and why I love studying migration studies is it's so interdisciplinary, right? It uses theories and frameworks from basically any fields that you want. And we wanted this to really showcase within the book. So this is why we have contributions from anthropology and sociology, but also ethnomusicology and political science. And as Gerda mentioned, I believe, but also something I just want to reiterate again, we hope that if you do read the text or if you read the book, that you do see some of these activist approaches that come out within the text, because we think it's important, especially within this field, that we can't only be academics and then kind of shut ourselves off from the reality on the ground of what's happening right now. We also have to take activist approaches to the work that we're doing, no matter where we are. And of course, this will look different from different regions, from different countries, and also from the insider-outsider perspective. I have certain privileges as a white American working in Cairo, for example, than my Egyptian colleague might have. And so kind of how these knowledge productions kind of come into play with this. And then just one thing, again, that I would like to end on is we thought, about if we're working on the so-called Global South, we really wanted these decolonial approaches to academia, right? Because there are other ways of knowledge production that aren't just producing texts and then the texts go out and other academics read them, and then that's kind of it. We wanted to really make sure that, okay, yes, we have these academic texts, but we also have artist contributions with photography and these other creative methodologies that are now becoming more usable or more used, I should say, in academia, take credence from other forms of knowledge production, especially from indigenous populations, but also different areas within the Global South. So we wanted to kind of include all of this within this very short, but I think rich text. It's only, yes, 14 chapters, but I think there's a lot there. And we hope that the audience also, takes note of this and appreciates that. Mm-hmm. Yes, Carlos.
Yeah, I would like to say that the workshop was really an excellent idea. It was an opportunity to exchange with people with, at least from my experience, I don't work usually, and this it was really stimulating also, I would like to underline a certain paradox that despite the fact that we are called Global South, at least from Latin America, we really know very little about Africa or Eurasia. I mean, the sense of belonging to the so-called Global South is in a certain way, is just a kind of narrative that don't account for knowledge. So in this way, I think this collection brings an opportunity to learn from colleagues and from migration experiences that usually are not familiar with, in my case, with my location in Central America. And this is interesting because it may be a certain understanding that the Global South is a kind of singular entity. And I think this book reveals the similarities and difference within what we call the Global South. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlos. Yeah, I think that's, yes, very insightful. So we just have a question from the Q&A box that I'm going to read for everyone to ponder and to answer. So from our colleague Kareem from Cologne. He asked, based on the book's contributions, what are the most important aspects and approaches researchers focusing on south to north migration, like myself, could learn from them on the conceptual and methodological levels?
Thank you very much for the question. Maybe I can start, Gerda, or Carlos or Elena? Do you want me to start? Perfect. Karim, thank you very much for your question. I think the main difficulty that I felt most throughout the entire process, from the very beginning to the very end, until we saw the book in our hands, was exactly this question to me, because as everyone who talked before me said, migration studies is very much Western focused in terms of conceptual discussions and conceptual developments and etc. So when it came to south-south migration, our friends and colleagues, and us included, had to think through what new conceptualizations we could bring. So what we could talk about was basically the mutual interdependencies that Sujata basically mentioned. These mutual, how North and South are not predefined geographies, but they are rather conceptual modifications that shape each other and change each other. And there are, of course, huge historical contexts. And we had to historicize each and every border regime, for example, where we discussed the south-south migration and how each border regime, let's say in Brazil, the one in Brazil, the one in Costa Rica, the one in Egypt and Sudan and Turkey, have been developed throughout the post-colonial histories. And that doesn't necessarily mean each and every country that I mentioned were post-colonies or are post-colonies. It means how the entire knowledge production regime of migration studies is developed through the post-colonial discussions because of the background histories and north-south divisions and north-south asymmetries in the world. That's what I can say. So maybe methodologically speaking, I can talk about historicization and also somewhat recentering the subject of migration studies. For us, for example, people on the move, that's why our book is called Making Roots. People on the move were at the center of our methodologies, and not the nation states. I don't know if that helps. Maybe you would like to add things. Gerda, Elena, and Carlos? If not, then I'm gonna read another question. Now that it's my turn. So there's another question. Apparently it's on Facebook, I think. Our audience says, looking back at this volume and the included chapters, what new areas that still needs to be researched and developed into a new volume or book on South-South migration? There you go. What would you suggest? I think for this question, Kuda and Sujata should also contribute because they might have suggestions.
Kuda, you want to begin first?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I have a response per se, except to say, I don't know, I'm just struggling a little with the question because it sort of takes us to that place again of, we kind of get concepts and then we kind of get onto them and then we start doing more work on them, right? Like I don't really think, for me, it's not really the question, like whether we should be doing more or looking about what areas. I think perhaps the next step is to even, like, I think Carlos just introduced something important to think about. Obviously the differences are there, the similarities are there. But maybe we also need to take a step back and also start to question some of this language and where it actually takes us. So I think one would need to sort of kind of reflect and see, is this the best way to kind of talk about this more kind of mobility to begin with, and perhaps what gets left out and what is it that can be, because again, yeah, and I think it goes back to even this very fundamental question that concerns people interested in this sort of knowledge production politics, whether it's actually possible to not reproduce certain hierarchies, certain notions, othering, racialization within the South, even within a South to South conception. So I think perhaps the question would be, I suppose, because as researchers, we like to create more problems. I suppose the next question is asking or sort of residing or inhabiting that particular conception for a bit of a while and see whether that really, whether that really works and, where it takes us. And perhaps then we can ask ourselves how we could talk about it differently. Because like I said I'm just speaking from my position where I was suggesting that it's almost an unfinished task. So we shouldn't be too comfortable always residing in one kind of way of talking about these things. Yeah. Thank you.
I think you put together a group of people who to edit a volume on South-South migration, and every group will probably produce a different volume. And there will be no right or wrong way of producing a volume and what is focused on, right? It's simply your own focus, your own priorities, what you think needs to be highlighted versus others. And there will be many others that you'll be forced to include in order to highlight certain aspects that you want to prioritize. Certainly, I think there could have been more chapters focusing on social and economic processes tied to migration, and also looking at economic growth within the global South and how that has reshaped migration patterns between contexts that have seen tremendous economic growth, things like China, India. How does that change relationships across countries, and how is it reshaping certain migration patterns? The other thing, and I think the other theme which I feel that sometimes we perhaps should emphasize, is this theme of hospitality. I just did a project in India with Nepali migrants, and what was really sort of very positive was how easily they are able to integrate in India. They don't face that same hostility, that the exclusion. And I think that's something also that we probably need to focus on, that the emphasis is very much on othering, on exclusion, on sort of xenophobia. So it was a rare occasion. I think it's driven sort of my own field work and what I found in this particular context. Yeah, those are some of the two points I would raise.
Thank you. Carlos, Elena, Gerda, do you have any suggestions for, or I'm gonna move to the next question? I don't know. I mean, that is also, I think, related to move next
Yeah, I
question.
just wanted to mention, following Sujata's comment, that probably a pressing challenge is how to address migration from a progressive point of view. I mean, usually we usually spend a huge effort making a critique of, as Sujata says, to xenophobia and othering and the rest, but little less energy and time is allocated in thinking about how a progressive politics of migration may look like. And I think this is usually everyday life pressing question for social movements and let's say the progressive umbrella. And I think we need to address seriously how to go beyond the critique of right-wing and mainstream views on migration. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I agree. Let's come together for for this question for the next time. Should I should I move to the next question? Because we have 4 more as far as I can see, and very little time left. So again, another participant of us asks, with everything happening in Gaza, Sudan and Lebanon and other territories, do you have an updated figure of displaced people worldwide? I mean, after Sujata's and Carlos's suggestions, my answer would be just a bleak picture. So maybe I'll pass this question.
I mean, maybe just 2 points on this. I think one is data and how we look at data, especially within migration, not only within the global south, but the global north. And, of course, statistics data are super important, but also just the importance we kind of place on data when these crises are happening right now. And people, I mean, I think most of us unfortunately have seen the videos and the photos coming out of Gaza and Sudan and Lebanon, and these kinds of things happening. So I personally don't have updated numbers because these are happening daily, these crises. And it's so hard, right, with people continuously moving. So I guess my second point is, so much has changed since this book was published, even though it's so recent. And I think this just, touches upon why this kind of work is important and these kind of questions are indeed important. But to remind ourselves, again, going back to the activist academic, that these crises are real. They're happening on a daily basis, not only within Africa and the Middle East, but also within Latin America and within Asia. And so, yeah, just to kind of bring back that humanistic approach. And yeah, I just think coming from working in Egypt, it's so hard to know numbers because Sudanese, for example, have come to Cairo. They've struggled in certain ways for some of them. So some of them have already returned. So do we have those numbers from when they cross the border and they're in Cairo? Do we already know how many returns? Everything is in such chaos, honestly, right now, that it's very difficult to have these types of statistics and numbers. So maybe within even, 5, 10, 15 years, we might look back on these, hopefully once the conflicts have ended, God willing. But yeah, sorry, I don't know if that's a bit long-winded, but it just kind of brought into my mind the humanistic approach that we want to bring in, the activist academic approach, but also how much has changed and is continuously changing and in the parts of the world that we live in.
Gerda, do you have nothing?
Anything else to the numbers? Actually, I just wonder, yeah, I can just second Elena, you know. We are meeting people who are now going back. We are meeting people who are coming from Lebanon, but I mean, there are no numbers. Let's put it like that. And actually, when I was thinking about the presentation, I was thinking of going into the numbers. When I was thinking, what does it bring to us, you know? Because there are always numbers we hear every day from UNHCR, from whatever, but it doesn't really, how to say, play out what's happening in reality. Especially at the moment, you know, like every day numbers are changing. People are moving here and there. And especially, I'm just talking from Cairo, Egypt at this particular moment. I'm not talking for anything else.
Thank you very much.
When I was thinking like about the other discussion about the migration issue, I know that there is this discussion, and I think it's a very interesting discussion, but I think we have to think about, there's always this kind of like migrant and the other divide. You know, we always have what we do, we reproduce with our own migration research. We are putting in a kind of divide of the people who are there and the people who are coming too. And I think actually this is something, I don't know, I have no answer to it. But I think this might be something that if we are talking about the Global South or whatever migration research, I think we should really think about questioning this, not only the categories of refugees or migrants, whatever, but also the people who are there and the others who are newcomers.
There's a long comment or question by Nairose Abdelmajid. I don't know if they are still with us. I cannot see the participants right now. I hope we are not too late to answer your question. So they say, congratulations, the book is incredibly insightful and a valuable contribution. Perfect, thank you, Susan. A valuable contribution to understanding migration in the Global South. Thank you very much. If I may ask and follow up on your words now, in my master's thesis at AUC and American University in Cairo, I don't know the other abbreviation, I found your writings very insightful. I explored the experiences of Ethiopian refugees in Cairo. During my fieldwork, I noticed that my positionality as an Egyptian made initially challenging to gain trust and access to the community within the political context and dam conflict. I wonder if this resonated with your own experiences working across such diverse regions. Did your personal backgrounds influence how participants engaged with you differently? Were any similarities or differences stood out in these diverse regions? By the way, Nairos has another question. Should I put them together or? So the second one is also with climate change becoming a growing area of concern, and as I have been selected as a delegate for COP29 focusing on climate mobility, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the intersection of environmental challenges with migration politics, particularly in the regions you focus on. If any of your experiences intersect with how environmental changes are shaping migration patterns or the policies states are adopting to deal with climate-induced displacement. Thanks lots. Thank you very much for your questions, and I'm leaving the floor to you. So for the methodology part, maybe Elena, you have.
Sure, I can briefly answer this, and I'll actually touch upon Dudu and Kuda's chapter, because I found your chapter super interesting about the insider-outsider approach to doing research, because I think there are pros and cons to both being an insider and doing research, a so-called insider and a so-called outsider. So for me in particular, I had worked with the community for a few years, but because I was an outsider, like an outsider. So for them, right, I'm coming not only from Sudan, but I'm not from the African continent. And so for them, they actually told me it was easier for them to trust me because I didn't really have any political leanings, or I didn't necessarily have any, cultural nuances that, might offend, because they kind of knew, oh, well, she's from North America. And so for them personally, this is what they told me. they found it much easier to talk to me than they would, for an example, another Sudanese researcher or someone from not Darfur, but maybe from North or South Sudan, or even from Egypt. So that's not to say that they wouldn't talk to these people, but they might say something different, or they might leave out certain things that they might tell me. And of course, they might tell someone from Egypt or from Sudan, let's say, something that they wouldn't tell me. So there's always kind of, and this is why analysis and going through your research and thinking about your own reflexivity and your positionality as a researcher is so important, and why I think there are pros and cons to both. But I think this, you have to think through this before you do your research. You know, what is ethical research, and what is my own position, and where am I coming, and to just be open and honest with your research participants, you know, as much as you can, to kind of gain that trust and that rapport. But that's my own personal experience.
Yeah, if I think, can I also just come in to say, I think it's always important to ask why you're doing the work, and this is with I think the conversations about you know, it's not simply that you have a proposal and you want to go do some work, and you know, so I think always constantly going back in that situation to seeing, you know, why you're doing the work, and if caught up in that kind of a situation, what are the ways to still manage to sort of achieve what your broader, you know, politics or agenda or activism or so I think it goes beyond looking at the process as like a technical process of I'm going to go in the field and do research and go back. Like you really have to I mean, yeah, you really have to be, well, that sounds a bit hippie, but there is something about the work that should be, you know, flowing and communicating with your own. And I think this is why when we talk about issues of, you know, epistemologies and how they're connected to your ontology, like this is your makeup. It has to do with how you approach things. So everything is connected in that way. And I think, I mean, those are just fancy words for thinking about the chemistry between you're working on, the people that you're working with, your own politics, activism, you know, and I think adjusting to that really does do help. And then maybe the question on climate migration, I think I don't research. You know, from where I'm located, there isn't. This is just becoming another area of interest, but there isn't really much work on that. Um, Particularly because it's also packaged in some of, you know, some of the discussions already about you know, because usually when people move because of climate, at least in the Southern African context, it's also connected to other governance structural issues, which make it less about. So it is about climate, definitely, but the inability to respond to those challenges to the extent that people are displaced usually means it's connected to other structural stuff, such as households not having enough income to be able to respond. So that's why, you know, or people not being able to be relocated. So that's why perhaps if you can compare it to if there's a hurricane, hypothetically somewhere in the States, the effects are probably not this, you know, you could talk about it as, you know, a climate issue, but you're not sort of inclined to think about it as climate mobility because it's, you know, people might be relocated or, you know, build new houses or whatever, right? So I think what I'm trying to say is that the conversation hasn't really moved specifically to that discourse, at least here per se, because these discussions are often packaged together in other conversations about people moving for other reasons that are connected to economies and, you know, and people's abilities to respond, poverty, deprivation. So I don't know how we transcend that, and you know, and if we should at all. But that's currently one of the things that I suppose I'm picking up here. But obviously, it gets different when you're going to maybe the East African, you know, region, or going up north, where perhaps, you know, coastal areas as well. So yeah, but at least from the Southern African context, that's my addition to that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan, how much time do we have? We still have 2 questions. How should we proceed?
It's okay. We can ask them. One of them is particularly interesting about the ghurba, so we still have like 5 more minutes to go through. It's okay.
Okay, perfect.
Eda, do you want, I can ask the next one, give you a break. So it says from an anonymous attendee, so whoever you are, hope you're still with us. Given the complex interplay of migration patterns, state policies, and cultural dynamics explored in Making Roots, how do you see the insights from this interdisciplinary study reshaping traditional migration theories, particularly in challenging the dominant North to South narrative?
Gerda, do you want to
I mean, I
start?
can start, but I think maybe others can also join us. I think one thing what we really wanted to focus or shape on it or discuss is like this kind of like dominant fixed categories. We are still there. We still have very often, because of legal categories, we have like migrants, refugees, especially here in Egypt, you have then the expats. So you have all these kind of categories, and these are kind of like tied to hierarchizations. And I think actually we wanted to tackle this kind of like divides and also these categorizations, because we think it's much more complicated. Refugees are not only migrants, and migrants are also sometimes refugees. So just like we think about these categories on the one hand. Eda, you want to join or you want to continue?
No, it's just I mean, we are talking from and about very different contexts, you know. When I see the word gurba, I realized in Turkish context, this very same word is used very often, especially by
Gurbe. Okay, no.
guest workers. It's gurbet in Turkish, and yeah, probably it's the same root, etymological root by the within Arabic, I imagine. So it means the nostalgic longing for one's country while you're away, whereas I mean, you are allowed to go back because you are not a refugee, quote unquote, but you are also not allowed to go back because of your socioeconomic conditions, because you have to work abroad and send money to your home country, etc. So it's like a very broad concept that conveys emotions, affects, conditions, circumstances, socioeconomic conditions, etc. So this gurba is used very often within, again, the so-called Turkish guest workers working in Europe. And that's what I wanted to say to the question. So yes, we use this concept very often in Turkey, among many others. For example, when it came to when the Syrian refugees first came, they came as, for example, muhajir, and that was a reference to the Islamic history of Ansar and Muhajir, so the host and the guest. So the host, the meaning the Turkish community should be responsible for making the Muhajir community feel home. And that was basically this first, very first call by the government, somewhat Islamizing the entire migration history, in a way to conceal the other political and socioeconomic background. So I mean, I'm not saying it with no critical comments. Of course, I'm very critical towards this understanding. But yeah, so the finding new concepts and names within the community is very, very common. That's what I wanted to say. And thank you very much for the question. That was surprising for me to hear as well, that gurba is used in other contexts.
Great. Carlos, do you have anything to add about either the methodological approaches and going maybe away from the north to south dynamic?
Yeah. Perhaps I would like to mention that reflexivity has been an issue in this event, but also is present in different forms in the collection itself. And probably two important ways of materializing reflexivity is to ask to whom and for what is migration research a contribution? I mean, which are the links and the bonds between migrant communities and the experience of research? And also, in what sense and for what the migration research is supposed to be a contribution? I think it could be a kind of, I would say, common concern in our own ways of working, despite the fact our difference in terms of location, disciplines, and so on. Probably these are two main concerns we have in common.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else has anything to say about any of the questions that have arisen. Last chance.
Yeah, if I can just quickly on also the terminologies, I think it's also important to think about how they also sort of reveal some kinds of animosity, xenophobia. So there are some terminologies as well that we find sort of in South Africa, that terms for foreigners or non-nationals or migrants that are, quite derogatory. So sometimes it's quite important how it reveals how people choose to see the other, right? Because it's not really the pleasant terms that are used that could actually show some of the positive. This host guest thing, it's usually sort of framed in this. Even the discourse becomes, if you're someone, the language sort of reveals how in that host guest kind of language, you can't get in someone's house and just start, throwing pillows on the floor and say, you should behave better. So, it's linked to all this criminalization. But, why would you come to a country and be a criminal? Whereas the question should be about who, a criminal is a criminal. So it starts to open up these other. So yeah, it's a good lens to also look at how language actually opens up and reveals people's attitudes towards people that they don't see as part of their communities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kuda. Anyone else? Thank you so much to all the participants for, I think, your really insightful and great questions and for interacting with us. I think I'm going to just hand it over to Susan.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you. I would like to thank all of our participants and panelists, Gerda, Eda, Elena, Carlos, Kudakwashe, and Sujata for this enlightening and relatable discussion. I just wanted to mention that Making Roots is part of our refugees and migrants within the Middle East book series. There are other 3 titles included in that series, and I could see that we would definitely see more books coming into that areas with everything happening in the world. But it's much needed studies. I also would like to thank our attendees who joined us today and join in the conversation. Don't forget, you can order your copy of Making Roots. You can find it in all major booksellers and online book retailers as well. And also can order it as an ebook, so make sure you order it. And you'll be able to find the recording of this talk and discussion on our Facebook page, the American University in Cairo Press, and shortly on our YouTube channel, AUC Press. So once again, I really want to thank you for taking the time of your day and effort. Sujata, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, and Kudakwashe as well. This is very, very exciting for all of us. And I hope that I could see all of you in our future virtual book talks.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kuda. Thank you, Sujata. And
Yes,
Susan
thank
for
you.
all the organization. Have a very nice evening, all.
Okay. You too. Bye.
Yes.
Bye-bye.